There is a moment just before dawn when the fog rises from the Atlantic and wraps itself around the Serra de Sintra like a burial shroud coming undone. The year is 1853. The month is February. The cold is the particular kind that seeps through wool and settles into bone. And in this cold, on this mountain, 700 meters above the sea, a small army of men is already at work. They have been working since 4 a.m. Some have walked 3 hours in darkness to reach this place, their boots finding the ancient paths by memory alone, because lantern oil is too precious to waste on the journey. Now they labor in shifting grays, hauling limestone blocks up gradients that would defeat a mule, mixing mortar that steams in the frigid air, chiseling ornamental flourishes into archways that most of them will never pass through as guests. Above them, emerging from the mist like something hallucinated, rises a structure that defies every rational principle of architecture. Towers in mustard yellow and terracotta red, domes borrowed from Moorish mosques, Gothic battlements, a gatehouse carved with sea monsters and rope motifs that recall the great Portuguese age of discovery. It is not one palace but many, stacked and fused and dreamed into being by a man who believes that beauty is a kind of medicine for the soul. That man is still asleep, 7 kilometers away, in the royal apartments of Lisbon's Necessidades Palace. His name is Fernando to the Portuguese who have never quite decided whether to love or distrust him, and he is the king consort of this small Atlantic nation. The palace taking shape on the mountain is his vision, his obsession, his attempt to render the impossible permanent. It will be called Pena, after the ancient hermitage it replaced, and it will become one of the most photographed, most visited, most celebrated structures in all of Europe. But on this cold February morning, the men hauling stones cannot see the future. They see only the next block, the next load, the next hour until their meager wages are counted into their calloused palms. They are the first to pay for this dream. They will not be the last. This is the story of Pena Palace, not as it appears in tourism brochures, airbrushed and eternal, but as it truly exists. A monument to human ambition sustained by human sacrifice, a fantasy that devours reality to maintain its spell, a structure that has teetered on the edge of oblivion more times than any visitor would ever guess. It is a story about the hidden costs of beauty, about what happens when a dream outlives its dreamer, and about the question that haunts every magnificent ruin that somehow refuses to become one. Who truly paid for this, and what does it cost to keep it alive? The first thing that overwhelms a visitor to Pena Palace is not any single detail but the sheer impossibility of the whole. The human mind, confronted with this structure, searches for precedent and finds none. This is not a medieval fortress, though it wears the mask of one. It is not a monastery, though a monastery's bones lie buried within its walls. It is not quite a palace in any traditional sense, though royalty lived here and received heads of state beneath its fantastical ceilings. It is, rather, a three-dimensional poem, an argument rendered in stone and stucco that the imagination should be taken as seriously as engineering, that romantic feeling is a legitimate foundation for architecture. The scale announces itself before any detail can register. The main structure sprawls across the summit of a rocky promontory, its footprint encompassing approximately 4,000 square meters of interior space. The towers reach heights of over 40 meters, making them visible from Lisbon on clear days, a distant crown of color floating above the Atlantic haze. The palace sits within a park of 200 hectares, nearly 500 acres, of engineered wilderness, every tree and pathway placed according to the aesthetic principles of the English landscape garden, creating the illusion of nature perfected rather than nature conquered. But it is the chromatic audacity that first stops visitors in their tracks. The walls are painted in shades that no European palace had dared before. Deep terracotta reds that suggest Venetian ochre at sunset, brilliant yellows that evoke Bavarian alpine lodges, and the original rose-pink tones that Ferdinand himself selected to catch the particular quality of Portuguese coastal light. The colors have been restored multiple times across the centuries, each restoration team working from paint samples scraped from beneath layers of weathering and crude 20th century overpaintings, trying to recapture the exact shades that Ferdinand once approved. The architectural vocabulary is deliberately polyphonic. A neo-Manueline entrance gate, encrusted with carved coral and rope motifs, leads to a Moorish courtyard with horseshoe arches that would not be out of place in the Alhambra. Gothic turrets rise beside Renaissance loggias. An Arab room features trompe-l'oeil frescoes that transform flat walls into endless geometric depths. The chapel contains 16th century alabaster and marble that predates the palace itself, salvaged from the original monastery and incorporated as a kind of architectural reliquary. Ferdinand intended this eclecticism. He called it the style of building for feeling rather than fashion, a deliberate rejection of the academic neoclassicism that dominated European court architecture in his era. He wanted a palace that felt discovered rather than designed, as if it had accreted across centuries of imagined history, a physical manifestation of the Romantic imagination's love affair with the medieval and the exotic. The interior spaces were conceived with the same theatrical intensity. The main drawing rooms feature walls covered in hand-painted murals depicting romantic landscapes and allegorical scenes. The furniture was custom-built to match the various historical fantasies of each room. Heavy Germanic pieces for the Gothic chambers, lighter French designs for the more intimate quarters, and throughout the artisanal tile work called azulejo that marked the palace as unmistakably Portuguese despite its cosmopolitan influences. There are over 500 documented objects in the palace's collection today, though this represents only a fraction of what once filled these rooms. Chandeliers of Bohemian crystal, ceremonial porcelain from the royal collections, tapestries woven in Flanders, liturgical objects in silver and gilt. Each piece was selected not for dynastic significance alone, but for its contribution to the overall atmospheric composition. Ferdinand curated his palace the way a conductor curates an orchestra, balancing tone and timbre, crescendo and silence. And then there are the views. The palace was positioned with almost preternatural precision to command sightlines that sweep from the Atlantic Ocean to the plains beyond Lisbon, to the distant blue mountains of the interior. On clear days, the horizon extends nearly 80 kilometers, an empire of light and air that renders every earthly concern small and temporary. Ferdinand spent hours on the terraces, sketching and painting, convinced that the landscape itself was a kind of text that the palace existed to frame and interpret. This was the fantasy made manifest. This was what visitors were meant to see and feel, a dream so consuming that the waking world disappeared entirely. But dreams require dreamers, and dreamers require breakfast, and breakfast requires kitchens, and kitchens require firewood, and firewood requires woodcutters, and woodcutters require wages, and wages require treasuries, and treasuries require taxes, and taxes require a nation willing to pay for a foreign king's romantic obsession. The visible palace, in other words, was always only half the story. Beneath the fairy tale architecture, another world existed entirely. It was a world of cellars and service corridors, of coal stores and ice houses, of heating systems that consumed forests and supply chains that stretched across continents. Without this hidden infrastructure, the visible palace would have been uninhabitable within a week. The heating system alone represented an engineering challenge of considerable complexity. The Serra de Sintra is not a particularly cold mountain by continental European standards, but its position along the Atlantic coast creates a microclimate of perpetual dampness. Fog and mist can blanket the summit for days at a time, and the stone walls of the palace, despite their thickness, absorbed this moisture and radiated cold into every interior space. Ferdinand's solution was a network of cast iron stoves positioned throughout the principal rooms, fed by a system of flues and chimneys that required constant maintenance. During the winter months, a team of at least 8 servants was dedicated solely to the management of fires, carrying fuel, stoking flames, cleaning ash, and ensuring that the elaborate ceramic stove tiles did not crack from thermal stress. The palace consumed, by surviving household records, approximately 15 tons of firewood and 3 tons of coal during an average winter season. This fuel had to be hauled up the mountain by cart and mule, along roads that became treacherous mud rivers during the rainy months. Water was an equally significant challenge. The palace sits on a granite outcropping, which means there are no natural springs at the summit itself. Ferdinand commissioned an elaborate system of cisterns and channels to capture rainwater, and rain on the Serra de Sintra is abundant. But this water required filtering and treatment before it could be used for cooking or drinking. The cisterns beneath the palace, carved into the living rock, could store approximately 200,000 liters, enough for roughly 3 months of normal operation. But during the summer dry season, water often had to be transported from springs lower on the mountain, adding yet another logistical burden to the estate's daily operations. The kitchens occupied a suite of rooms in the lower reaches of the palace, deliberately positioned to keep heat, noise, and cooking odors away from the royal apartments. The main kitchen featured multiple hearths for different cooking methods, a separate pastry room with its own oven, and a series of preparation areas for the cleaning and butchering of game. Cold storage rooms, partially cut into the mountain's northern slope where temperatures remained relatively stable, held provisions that might need to last for weeks when weather made resupply impossible. And then there were the stables. Ferdinand was an accomplished horseman who kept a stable of riding horses, carriage horses, and working animals for the constant transport needs of the estate. The stables complex, located on a lower terrace of the mountain, could accommodate up to 30 horses and employed a staff of grooms, farriers, and carriage drivers whose workday began hours before any royal stirring. The laundry operation was another hidden enterprise of remarkable scale. The palace contained hundreds of bed linens, tablecloths, servants' uniforms, and ceremonial garments that required regular washing, drying, and pressing. Laundry rooms equipped with copper washing tubs and heated pressing irons operated continuously, staffed by women who hauled water, boiled linens, and operated the heavy pressing equipment that could cause permanent injury to inattentive workers. Maintenance was perpetual. The combination of Atlantic salt air, mountain fog, and the experimental nature of the construction materials meant that something was always failing. Roof tiles cracked, painted surfaces blistered, ironwork rusted. The decorative stucco, applied in complex patterns that caught every drop of wind-driven rain, eroded constantly and required skilled craftsmen to repair. Ferdinand employed a permanent maintenance staff of at least 15 workers whose sole task was to walk the palace and its grounds, identifying problems and addressing them before they became catastrophic. The gardens required their own army. Ferdinand had planted the park with species from around the world: North American sequoias, Australian tree ferns, Japanese camellias, Chinese magnolias, creating a living museum of global botany. But exotic plants require specialized care, and the Sintra climate, while mild, still posed challenges. Garden staff numbered over 20 during the peak years, not counting the additional laborers brought in for seasonal work like hedge trimming, gravel raking, and the endless battle against invasive species. All of this activity, the heating, the water management, the cooking, the cleaning, the grooming, the maintenance, the gardening, occurred every single day, year after year, largely invisible to the royal family who moved through the public spaces as if sustained by magic. The servants' quarters occupied the less scenic portions of the complex modest rooms with modest furnishings where exhausted men and women fell into exhausted sleep before rising to do it all again. This was the true engine of Pena Palace, not romantic vision but ceaseless labor, not artistic genius but organizational competence, not the dreams of a king but the sweat of hundreds of anonymous workers whose names appear in household ledgers as line items, so much paid for so many days of work, and nowhere else in the historical record. Who was the man who set all this in motion? To understand Pena Palace, one must understand Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, one of the 19th century's most improbable monarchs, a German prince who became Portuguese by marriage, a reluctant king who preferred the company of artists to politicians, and an aesthetic visionary whose obsessions would shape Portugal's landscape long after his dynasty crumbled into history. Ferdinand was born in 1816 in Vienna during the final convulsions of the Napoleonic Wars. His family, the House of Saxe-Coburg, was minor German nobility with major European ambitions. They had a particular talent for matrimonial advancement, placing their sons and daughters in royal courts across the continent through strategic marriage alliances. Ferdinand's uncle Leopold would become King of Belgium. His cousin Albert would marry Queen Victoria. The Coburgs were, in the words of one contemporary observer, Europe's royal stud farm. Ferdinand himself was not initially destined for a throne. As a younger son, he was raised to support rather than lead, trained in the arts and humanities that would allow him to ornament a court without challenging its power structure. He studied music, painting, and architecture with unusual intensity, developing genuine talent in each. He played the piano well enough to perform before audiences. He painted watercolors that were technically accomplished, if somewhat conventional. He absorbed architectural theory with the enthusiasm of an amateur who never had to worry about practical engineering. The marriage that changed everything came in 1836, when Ferdinand was 20 years old. Maria II of Portugal needed a husband. She was young, newly restored to her throne after a brutal civil war, and under pressure from European powers to stabilize her dynasty through marriage. Ferdinand, presentable and well-connected, was the chosen candidate. The wedding was arranged with dynastic efficiency, and Ferdinand sailed to Lisbon to meet his bride. The marriage unexpectedly became a genuine partnership. Maria was practical and politically shrewd. Ferdinand was imaginative and culturally sophisticated. They complemented each other. They also produced 11 children together, an abundance of heirs that secured the Braganza-Coburg line for generations. After Maria's death in childbirth in 1853, Ferdinand would become regent for his young son Pedro, wielding political power he had never sought and largely didn't want. What Ferdinand wanted, passionately and single-mindedly, was Pena. He had first visited the ruins of the 16th century monastery atop the Serra de Sintra in 1838, shortly after arriving in Portugal. The site captivated him immediately. The remote location, accessible only by rough mountain paths, the ruins of the old Hieronymite chapel, abandoned since the great Lisbon earthquake of 1755, had made the buildings unsafe. The views that seemed to encompass the entire known world, and the atmosphere, that peculiar Sintra atmosphere of mist and mystery that had attracted poets and hermits for centuries. Ferdinand saw in these ruins not decay, but possibility. He envisioned a palace that would resurrect the spirit of medieval monasticism while adding the comforts and splendors of modern royalty. He wanted a building that would embody the romantic philosophy he had absorbed in his German education, the belief that art and nature, properly harmonized, could elevate the human soul beyond the material world's corruptions. He purchased the monastery and its surrounding lands in 1838, using his personal funds rather than state treasury. This distinction would matter later, when questions of ownership became politically fraught. From the beginning, Ferdinand conceived of Pena as his personal project, his artistic statement, his gift to Portugal and to posterity. For the actual design and construction, Ferdinand hired Ludwig von Eschwege, a German mining engineer and architect who had been working in Portugal since 1803. Eschwege was not a visionary designer in the mold of Viollet-le-Duc or John Ruskin, but he was a practical builder who could translate Ferdinand's romantic imaginings into structural reality. The collaboration was sometimes contentious. Ferdinand constantly demanded changes and additions, pushing the design further into fantasy, while Eschwege worried about foundations and load-bearing walls, but ultimately productive. Construction began in 1842. Ferdinand visited the site obsessively throughout the building years, sometimes weekly, always with sketchbooks and opinions. He would climb the scaffolding to inspect details personally, arguing with craftsmen about the curve of an arch or the placement of a decorative element. He commissioned artworks, selected furnishings, approved paint colors. He designed portions of the park himself, specifying which trees should be planted where, which paths should wind in which directions. His wife Maria supported the project financially and emotionally, though she was less enthusiastic about the remote mountain location. She preferred the comforts of established palaces, the social life of the capital. When she died in 1853, Ferdinand channeled his grief into accelerated work on Pena, as if completion of the dream could somehow compensate for the loss of the partner with whom he had hoped to share it. After his official retirement from public life in 1855, Ferdinand increasingly withdrew to Pena. He remarried in 1869 to Elise Hensler, a German-Swiss opera singer whom he created Countess of Edla. The marriage scandalized Portuguese society, a former king wedding an actress, but Ferdinand had long since ceased caring about social approval. He built a small chalet for Elise in the Pena Park, a retreat within a retreat, and there they lived out his final years in relative isolation. Ferdinand died in 1885 at the age of 69. He had spent nearly half a century dreaming, building, and refining his mountain palace. He left behind a masterpiece in a financial tangle that would take decades to resolve. The building of Pena Palace was not a single construction project, but an ongoing transformation that consumed the better part of 2 decades. The process reveals both the ambition of Ferdinand's vision and the punishing realities of trying to build a fantasy on a granite mountaintop in an era before mechanized construction. The site itself posed the first and most fundamental challenge. The monastery ruins sat on a rocky promontory with almost no level ground. Every new structure had to either incorporate the existing rock or be supported by elaborate foundation work carved into stone. The main palace grew around and above the old monastery buildings, preserving the 16th century chapel and cloister while wrapping them in new construction like an architectural cocoon. Materials arrived from across Portugal and beyond. The limestone for the main structures was quarried locally in Sintra, but the granite for foundation work came from quarries near Lisbon. The marble for floors and decorative elements was brought from Estremoz, nearly 200 kilometers away. Cork for insulation, a Portuguese specialty, came from the Alentejo region. Exotic woods for furniture and paneling were imported through Lisbon's docks, arriving from Brazil, India, and the Portuguese African colonies. The logistics of transporting these materials to the summit were extraordinary. There was no road suitable for heavy carts, only ancient mule paths that wound through the forested slopes. Every block of stone, every beam of timber, every barrel of lime for mortar had to be transported by animal power or human muscle. During peak construction periods, witnesses reported continuous lines of workers and pack animals snaking up the mountain from dawn until dusk. The labor force fluctuated with the seasons and the availability of funds. At peak periods, over 200 workers might be on site simultaneously. Stonemasons, carpenters, roofers, painters, plasterers, metal workers, and the unskilled laborers who did the hauling and heavy lifting. Most were Portuguese, recruited from Sintra and the surrounding villages, but specialized craftsmen were sometimes brought from Lisbon or even from abroad. German and Italian artisans appear in the construction records, hired for specific decorative elements that local workers lacked the training to execute. Working conditions were harsh by any standard. The mountainside was exposed to wind and weather, and construction continued through winter months when fog could reduce visibility to a few meters. Accidents were common. The historical records are incomplete, but references to workers injured by falling stones or scaffolding collapses appear periodically in the surviving documents. There are no records of deaths, but this may simply reflect incomplete documentation rather than actual safety. Wages were modest by European standards, but represented significant income for rural Portuguese workers. A skilled mason might earn enough to support a family, an unskilled laborer barely enough to feed himself. Payment was typically weekly, in cash, and the household accounts show occasional disputes over amounts owed and work completed. There were no unions, no formal contracts, no protections beyond whatever goodwill the royal household chose to extend. The work schedule followed daylight rather than clocks. During summer months, workdays could extend to 14 hours. In winter, work ceased when visibility failed. Sunday was a rest day, observed out of religious custom rather than any labor regulation. Holy days provided additional breaks, and Portuguese Catholicism provided many holy days. Ferdinand's constant changes and additions complicated the construction timeline significantly. The project that Eschwege initially estimated would take 5 to 7 years ultimately stretched to 12, with additional modifications continuing even after the royal family began using the palace in 1854. Each change, an additional tower here, an expanded terrace there, a decorative element that required specialized craftsmanship, added time and cost. The chapel restoration proved particularly complex. The 16th century structure, with its exquisite alabaster and marble work attributed to the sculptor Niccolo Chantereine, required delicate preservation while the new construction rose around it. Cracks in the original stonework had to be stabilized without damaging historic surfaces. The readable, a masterpiece of Portuguese Renaissance sculpture, was cleaned and conserved in place. The park development proceeded simultaneously with palace construction and continued long after. Ferdinand's vision required not just planting, but reshaping the mountain landscape itself. New paths were cut through existing forest, drainage channels were dug to prevent erosion, terraces were carved for specific plantings. The soil on the granite mountainside was thin and poor, requiring significant amendment before the exotic species Ferdinand coveted could thrive. Seeds and plants arrived from botanical gardens across Europe and from Portuguese colonial territories. The sequoias, now among the largest trees in Portugal, were planted as seedlings brought from California. The tree ferns came from Australia and New Zealand. The camellias arrived from established collections in northern Portugal, where the species had been cultivated since the 18th century. Each planting required ongoing care, watering during dry spells, protection from wind damage, pruning and shaping according to the landscape design. By the time Ferdinand considered the palace substantially complete in 1854, he had spent an amount that contemporary sources estimated at roughly 350,000 reais, a significant fortune, roughly equivalent to the annual operating budget of a medium-sized Portuguese city. This was personal expenditure, not state funds, drawn from Ferdinand's Coburg family resources and his Portuguese royal income. But the distinction between personal and public money was always somewhat blurred in monarchical accounting, and Portuguese critics would later argue that Ferdinand's spending on Pena represented a misallocation of resources that could have benefited the nation. The human cost is harder to quantify. The 12 years of intensive construction employed thousands of workers across their duration. Some found steady employment and developed valuable skills. Others were hired and released with the seasons, earning just enough to survive before moving on to the next job. The workers who hauled stones up the mountain in 1845 were not the same workers who painted decorative finishes in 1853. The palace consumed labor the way it consumed limestone, in bulk, continuously, and with little sentiment about individual contributions. What remains is the building itself, extraordinary, improbable, and innocent of its own origins. The visitors who crowd the terraces today see the dream fulfilled. They do not see the backs that bent, the hands that bled, the wages that barely sustained families through the hungry months. That invisibility is part of the illusion. The palace was designed to seem eternal, effortless, inevitable, as if it had always existed and always would. From the moment of its completion, Pena Palace began to consume money. The romantic dream required constant feeding, and the realities of maintenance on an exposed Atlantic mountain proved far more expensive than even pessimistic estimates had predicted. The household accounts from the 1860s and 1870s, partially preserved in Portuguese national archives, reveal an operation of considerable complexity and constant financial pressure. During periods of royal residence, which became less frequent after Maria's death, the palace required a permanent staff of approximately 60 persons. This included household servants, kitchen staff, gardeners, stable hands, and maintenance workers. Staff wages alone consumed roughly 40,000 reais annually, equivalent to the income of a prosperous merchant family. But wages represented only a fraction of operating costs. Food for the household, including provisions for servants, guests, and the constant stream of visitors who expected hospitality, added another significant expense. The palace maintained accounts with suppliers in Sintra, Lisbon, and the surrounding agricultural regions, purchasing meat, fish, bread, wine, and produce, in quantities that reflected the scale of operations. Heating remained the single largest consumable expense. The palace's location ensured that it felt cold and damp for roughly half the year, and Ferdinand's personal comfort demanded fires burning in every occupied room. The annual fuel bill, firewood and coal combined, exceeded 10,000 reis, a sum that could have supported multiple working families for a year. The gardens were equally voracious. The exotic plantings required specialized care, and specialized care required specialized workers. Ferdinand employed a head gardener on a permanent salary, supplemented by a team of assistant gardeners and seasonal laborers. The botanical specimens themselves represented ongoing expense, replacements for plants that died, new acquisitions to complete Ferdinand's vision, specialized soils and fertilizers to maintain plants adapted to very different climates. Repairs and maintenance constituted an unpredictable but ever-present drain. The palace's experimental construction, combining traditional materials with innovative techniques, historical forms with modern infrastructure, meant that failure modes were often unexpected. Decorative elements cracked in ways that solid masonry would not. Paintwork exposed to the salt-laden Atlantic winds deteriorated faster than interior surfaces. The elaborate metalwork of railings, gates, and decorative elements rusted constantly. The roof presented particular challenges. The complex silhouette that made the palace so visually striking also created countless opportunities for water infiltration. The joints between towers and connecting structures were points of persistent leakage. The glazed tiles that covered the domes required careful maintenance to prevent water from seeping beneath and causing structural damage. A dedicated roofing crew worked on the palace almost continuously, moving from section to section in an endless cycle of inspection and repair. Ferdinand attempted various strategies to offset these costs. The park included productive elements, orchards, vegetable gardens, grazing lands that supplied some of the household's needs. The forests were managed for timber, providing both fuel wood and income from sales. Surplus produce from the gardens was sold to local merchants, but these revenues never approached the expenditures. The gap between income and outgo widened steadily. By the 1870s, Ferdinand had effectively exhausted his personal resources. The Coburg family contributions had diminished. His Portuguese income as a former king consort was fixed and insufficient. He began quietly selling lands from the estate's periphery, parcels that did not directly border the palace or affect its views, to raise operating funds. These sales, conducted discreetly to avoid public embarrassment, reduced the overall acreage, but preserved the core of the property. His second marriage complicated the financial picture. The Countess of Edla had no resources of her own, and Ferdinand's support of her household, including the chalet he built for her in the park, added to the overall drain. Portuguese critics, never reconciled to the marriage, accused Ferdinand of squandering national patrimony on his former actress wife. The criticism was unfair. The funds were technically personal, not public, but it reflected broader anxieties about the sustainability of Ferdinand's lifestyle. When Ferdinand died in 1885, his will revealed the true precariousness of the situation. He bequeathed Pena to the Countess of Edla, a decision that outraged the Portuguese royal family and set off years of legal conflict. The bequest was eventually overturned, with the property reverting to the crown, but not before prolonged litigation had further damaged both the estate's finances and its physical condition. The years of legal dispute, roughly 1885 to 1889, were years of deferred maintenance. Without clear ownership, no one took responsibility for the continuous repairs that the palace required. The roof leaked, the gardens grew wild, the painted surfaces continued their slow deterioration. By the time the property officially returned to royal hands, significant damage had accumulated. King Carlos V, Ferdinand's grandson, attempted to restore Pena to functionality in the 1890s. He allocated funds for major repairs and brought in specialists to address the most critical deterioration. But Carlos faced his own financial constraints. The Portuguese monarchy was increasingly squeezed between fixed revenues and rising costs, and the restoration was never as complete as the situation demanded. The operating model that emerged during Carlos's reign was essentially one of managed decline. The palace was maintained sufficiently for occasional royal visits, but it was never again a regular residence. Staff levels were reduced, gardens were simplified, the exotic plantings were allowed to naturalize or die, replaced by hardier species that required less specialized care. The palace remained impressive, but those who remembered Ferdinand's era could see the difference. This fragile equilibrium could not survive the political earthquake that was coming. The crisis that nearly destroyed Pena Palace arrived not as a single catastrophe, but as a series of blows that fell in quick succession, each one compounding the damage of those before. The first and most decisive was political, the overthrow of the Portuguese monarchy in October 1910. The revolution was swift and relatively bloodless by the standards of such events. King Manuel II, great-grandson of Ferdinand and last of the Braganza line, fled to exile in England. The republic proclaimed by the revolutionaries immediately began the process of nationalizing royal properties. Pena Palace, along with the other great estates of the Portuguese crown, passed into state ownership virtually overnight. Nationalization brought its own complications. The new Republican government was ideologically committed to dismantling the symbols of monarchical excess, but it was also cash-strapped and uncertain how to manage the vast portfolio of properties it had suddenly acquired. Some royal palaces were converted to government offices, others became museums. A few were simply locked and left to deteriorate while bureaucrats debated their fate. Pena fell into an administrative limbo. The palace was officially designated a national monument, which protected it from sale or demolition, but this designation came without corresponding funds for maintenance. The skeleton staff retained to guard the property could do little more than prevent outright looting. Repairs ceased almost entirely. The gardens, already simplified under Carlos I, reverted toward wilderness. The First World War, though Portugal's involvement was limited, further strained state resources. The economy contracted, government budgets tightened, cultural properties ranked low on any rational list of priorities. Pena continued its slow deterioration, visited occasionally by tourists and scholars who wrote mournful accounts of faded grandeur. The interwar period brought a new political reality. The authoritarian Estado Novo regime of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Beginning in the 1930s, Salazar's government embarked on an ambitious program of national monuments restoration, driven partly by genuine conservation impulses and partly by the regime's desire to claim continuity with Portugal's imperial past. Pena Palace benefited significantly from this program. The restoration of the 1930s and 1940s addressed decades of accumulated neglect. Roofs were repaired, structural cracks were stabilized, the most severely deteriorated decorative elements were conserved or replaced. The gardens received attention for the first time in a generation. By the end of the Salazar era, Pena looked more like Ferdinand's vision than it had since his death. But these restorations were not without controversy. The ideological priorities of the Estado Novo shaped decisions about what to preserve and how to present it. Ferdinand's cosmopolitan vision, his deliberate embrace of multiple cultural influences, his celebration of artistic eclecticism, sat awkwardly with the regime's emphasis on specifically Portuguese national identity. The Restoration tended to emphasize Portuguese elements and minimize Germanic influences. Some details were quietly altered, others were simply allowed to disappear. The original color scheme proved particularly contentious. Ferdinand's palace had been painted in vivid, even garish colors that reflected the romantic sensibility of its era. By the mid-20th century, these colors seemed vulgar to more conservative tastes. The Restoration initially muted the palette, substituting more dignified earth tones for Ferdinand's brilliant yellows and reds. The palace became, for several decades, a different building than its creator had intended. The Second World War brought its own anxieties. Portugal remained officially neutral, but the possibility of invasion by either Axis or Allied forces was never entirely absent. Contingency plans were developed for the evacuation of movable treasures from national monuments. At Pena, this meant identifying which objects could be transported and which would have to be abandoned if the worst occurred. The invasion never came, but the planning process revealed just how much of the palace's contents were effectively immovable. The frescoes, the built-in furniture, the architectural details that were integral to the structure. The immediate post-war period was characterized by continued state management and cautious tourism. Pena Palace opened to general visitors in this era, generating modest revenues that partially offset maintenance costs. But the fundamental tension between the expense of proper conservation and the limited resources available remained unresolved. The Revolution of 1974, which ended the Estado Novo and restored democracy to Portugal, brought yet another period of uncertainty. The new government had urgent priorities: political stabilization, economic development, decolonization, that left little bandwidth for cultural heritage. Pena continued under the same management structures established during the dictatorship, but investment declined as the state grappled with more pressing concerns. By the 1980s, the situation was becoming critical. Decades of deferred maintenance had accumulated into major structural problems. Water infiltration had damaged significant interior surfaces. The gardens had again grown wild, with invasive species overwhelming Ferdinand's carefully planned compositions. The collection of furnishings and artworks, never properly inventoried or conserved, included pieces in urgent need of professional attention. International observers began raising alarms. Portugal's application to join the European Economic Community, later the European Union, increased scrutiny of its cultural heritage management. The UNESCO World Heritage Program, established in 1972, offered both validation and expectation. Properties of global significance carried global responsibility. Something had to change. The old model, direct state management with chronic underfunding, could not sustain a property of Pena's complexity and fragility. New approaches were needed. They would require not just money, but a fundamental reimagining of what the palace was for and who was responsible for its survival. The transformation of Pena Palace from crumbling monument to functioning heritage institution required decisions that would have been unthinkable to Ferdinand and might still strike purists as betrayals of the romantic ideal. Survival, it turned out, demanded precisely the pragmatism that Romanticism defined itself against. The critical decision came in 1992, when the Portuguese state created Parques de Sintra Monte da Lua, a public company charged with managing the cultural landscape of Sintra, including Pena Palace. This new structure represented a fundamental departure from traditional state heritage management. Instead of a bureaucratic department dependent on annual government allocations, Parques de Sintra was organized as a semi-autonomous enterprise expected to generate a significant portion of its own revenues. The implications were profound. Pena Palace was no longer simply a monument to be preserved. It was an enterprise to be managed. Visitors were no longer just citizens exercising their cultural rights. They were customers whose fees would determine the institution's capacity for conservation. The logic of the market had entered the romantic sanctuary. Initial reactions from preservationists were skeptical, even hostile. They feared that commercial pressures would drive inappropriate development, souvenir shops where there should be contemplative spaces, food courts where there should be gardens. They worried that the pressure to maximize revenues would lead to overcrowding, accelerated wear on fragile surfaces, the destruction of the very atmosphere that made the palace special. Some of these fears proved justified, others were managed through careful planning. Parque de Sintra implemented a comprehensive approach that balanced revenue generation with conservation imperatives. The gardens were restored according to historical principles, with Ferdinand's original plant palette painstakingly reconstructed from surviving records and botanical analysis. The palace interiors underwent systematic conservation, with professional teams addressing the accumulated damage of decades. The color restoration proved particularly significant. Beginning in the 1990s, conservators scraped back layers of paint to reach the original surfaces, analyzing pigment composition to determine exactly what colors Ferdinand had specified. The results were startling. The muted tones of the Salazar-era restoration were entirely inauthentic. Ferdinand's palace had been brilliant, even shocking in its chromatic intensity. The decision to restore the original colors was controversial. Some visitors preferred the more tasteful palette they remembered, but it was historically correct. The restoration of the gardens was equally ambitious and equally controversial. Ferdinand's park had included species from around the world, many of them now naturalized and spreading in ways he never intended. The conservation team faced difficult choices: preserve the ecological reality that had developed over a century, or reconstruct the historical design that Ferdinand had implemented. They chose a middle path, removing the most invasive species while accepting that some historical plantings could not be replicated with available resources. The visitor experience was carefully managed. Timed entry tickets, introduced in the early 2000s, prevented overcrowding during peak periods. A new visitor center at the base of the mountain provided orientation and services, reducing pressure on the historic core. Designated pathways through the palace and gardens channeled foot traffic away from the most fragile areas. The business model that emerged was tourism-dependent, but not tourism-dominated. Entrance fees generated the largest revenue stream, supplemented by gift shop sales, cafe operations, and venue rentals for special events. These revenues funded both operations and conservation, creating a virtuous cycle in which visitor interest financed the preservation that maintained visitor interest. The numbers tell the story. By the mid-2010s, Pena Palace was receiving over 1.5 million visitors annually, making it one of Portugal's most visited monuments. Entrance fees generated millions of euros in annual revenue. Parques de Sintra employed over 700 people across its various properties, many of them in skilled conservation and horticultural roles. The organization was financially self-sustaining, no longer dependent on uncertain government allocations. But success brought its own challenges. The sheer volume of visitors, concentrated in summer months when Sintra's mild climate attracts tourists from hotter regions, stressed both infrastructure and the visitor experience. On peak days, the palace could feel less like a romantic retreat and more like a particularly crowded museum with queues at every choke point and selfie seekers jostling for position at scenic viewpoints. Climate change introduced new uncertainties. The Sintra microclimate, which Ferdinand had loved for its mists and mild temperatures, was shifting. Summers were becoming hotter and drier. Winter storms were becoming more intense. The exotic plantings, adapted to specific conditions, showed signs of stress. Fire risk in the surrounding forests, never a major concern in the misty 19th century, became a serious consideration requiring active management. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2021 brought the most severe crisis since the Revolution of 1910. With international tourism halted virtually overnight, the revenue model that sustained Pena Palace collapsed. The organization survived through a combination of emergency government support, operational retrenchment, and the digital pivot that allowed virtual visitors to replace physical ones temporarily. But the vulnerability of a tourism-dependent funding model was starkly revealed. The recovery has been strong, but has not eliminated fundamental questions about sustainability. Should entrance fees be raised to generate larger conservation budgets at the risk of making the palace accessible only to wealthy visitors? Should visitor numbers be permanently capped to protect the site, even if this means turning away paying customers? How should the institution balance its role as a Portuguese national monument with its position in a global tourism marketplace? These questions have no simple answers. They represent the ongoing tension between Pena Palace's identity as a romantic dream, timeless, transcendent, beyond mundane concerns, and its reality as a physical artifact requiring continuous intervention to survive. The fantasy of effortless beauty persists in visitor imaginations. The reality of effort without end shapes institutional planning. Today, as on that foggy morning in 1853, Pena Palace requires an army to maintain it. The army is different now, professionals rather than peasant laborers, conservators rather than construction workers, but the scale of effort is comparable. The dream has not become self-sustaining with age. If anything, its demands have grown. The conservation team responsible for the palace buildings includes specialists in masonry, painting, metalwork, and textiles. Their work is invisible by design. Successful conservation means that visitors see what appears to be original fabric, not obvious repairs. They operate on multiple timescales simultaneously. Daily monitoring for emerging problems, seasonal maintenance programs, and multi-year conservation projects addressing systemic issues. The roof remains the building's most vulnerable system. The complex geometry that gives the palace its silhouette creates innumerable opportunities for water infiltration. Every joint, every valley, every penetration for chimneys or decorative elements is a potential failure point. The roofing team conducts annual comprehensive inspections, clearing debris, resealing flashings, replacing damaged tiles. Despite this attention, leaks occur regularly, and their consequences can be severe. Water that enters the structure damages painted surfaces, weakens decorative stucco, and promotes the biological growth that accelerates material decay. The interior spaces require environmental management that Ferdinand never imagined. Humidity control, temperature, stabilization, and light filtering all contribute to the longevity of fragile materials. The palace now includes discrete climate control systems invisible to visitors that maintain conditions within parameters determined by conservation science. These systems consume energy continuously, adding to operating costs and environmental footprint. The collection of furnishings and artworks requires specialized care. Textiles must be protected from light and insects. Painted surfaces must be monitored for cracking and flaking. Metals must be treated to prevent corrosion. Each category of material has its own vulnerabilities and its own protocols. The conservation staff maintains detailed records of every object's condition, tracking changes over time and scheduling interventions accordingly. The gardens present a different but equally demanding challenge. The horticultural team includes botanists, arborists, and landscape specialists who understand both the historical significance of Ferdinand's plantings and the ecological realities of the current environment. Their work involves not just maintenance, mowing, pruning, weeding, but active management of plant health, soil conditions, and water resources. The old exotic specimens, now more than 150 years old in some cases, require particular attention. The sequoias planted as seedlings in Ferdinand's era are now massive trees, vulnerable to disease and storm damage. The tree ferns from Australasia, far from their natural habitat, depend on the specific microclimate conditions that Sintra provides. Any shift in those conditions threatens their survival. The camellias, some of them among the oldest cultivated specimens in Portugal, are living historical documents requiring expert care. New challenges have emerged that Ferdinand could not have anticipated. Invasive species introduced accidentally or through 19th century horticultural fashion threaten to overwhelm native and heritage plantings. The Pittosporum from New Zealand, once prized as an ornamental, now spreads aggressively through the understory. The management team must balance removal of invasives against disruption of established ecosystems. Fire prevention has become a critical concern. The Mediterranean climate produces hot, dry summers, and climate change is intensifying this pattern. The forests surrounding the palace, forests that Ferdinand planted to create his romantic landscape, are now recognized as fire hazards requiring active management. Fire breaks are maintained, vegetation is cleared around structures, emergency water supplies are positioned at strategic points. The romance of the wild mountain forest has been tempered by awareness of its danger. Water management remains as challenging as in Ferdinand's era, though the methods have changed. The original cisterns still function, supplemented now by municipal water supply piped up the mountain. Irrigation systems distribute water to the garden areas that need it most, reducing waste compared to the hand watering of the 19th century. But the infrastructure is aging and replacement costs are significant. The visitor services operation represents another layer of ongoing effort. The ticketing system, the guided tour program, the audio guide technology, the cafes and gift shops, all require staffing, management, and periodic reinvention to meet changing visitor expectations. The digital presence, website, social media, virtual tour offerings, demands continuous content creation and platform maintenance. Even the parking facilities require management, balancing the needs of visitors against the traffic impacts on the narrow mountain roads. Security has become more sophisticated than the simple watchman of the 19th century. Electronic surveillance systems monitor both visitors and premises. Fire detection systems provide early warning of thermal events. Climate monitoring systems track conditions that might threaten collections. Access control systems manage who can enter which spaces and when. All of this technology requires maintenance, updates, and eventual replacement. The financial machinery that supports all this effort is itself a management challenge. Budget preparation, revenue tracking, cost control, capital planning, the administrative work of keeping the institution solvent consumes significant resources. external relations, with government oversight bodies, with tourism promotion organizations, with academic institutions, with the international heritage community, require dedicated attention. And the human relations dimension should not be forgotten. The 700 employees of Parques de Sintra across all its properties are people with careers, expectations, and rights. They require training, supervision, fair compensation, and the organizational culture that allows them to do their best work. Managing this human enterprise is itself a full-time responsibility for senior leadership. All of this activity unfolds behind the scenes, in offices and workshops and storerooms that visitors never see. The palace presents its dreaming face to the world. The institution presents its working face to itself. The gap between these faces is the gap between romance and reality, between the story we tell about beautiful things and the truth of what it takes to keep them. At dawn on a clear day in the early 21st century, you can still stand on the terrace where Ferdinand once stood and see the view that captured his imagination nearly 2 centuries ago. The Atlantic shimmers to the west, endless and essentially unchanged. Lisbon spreads to the south, larger now but still recognizable as the city that welcomed a young German prince in 1836. The forests of Sintra sweep down the mountain slopes, greener perhaps than in Ferdinand's era, thanks to the exotic plantings his vision introduced. But nothing else is as it was. The workers who climb the mountain now arrive by car or bus, not on foot in the pre-dawn darkness. The labor they perform is skilled and specialized, not the raw muscle power that moved thousands of tons of stone. The institution that employs them is a modern enterprise with annual reports and performance metrics, not a royal household operating on the whims of an artistic king. Ferdinand's dream has survived, but it has survived by becoming something he might not recognize and might not approve. The palace is no longer a private retreat for a sensitive soul. It is a public institution serving millions. The gardens are no longer a personal expression of botanical enthusiasm. They are a managed landscape, maintained according to professional protocols. The experience of visiting is no longer a privileged encounter with royal taste. It is a consumer product sold through international marketing channels. Is this betrayal or preservation? The question depends on what we think the palace was meant to be. If Ferdinand's vision was essentially personal, a refuge from the compromises of public life, a space where imagination could reign unchallenged, then its transformation into a tourism destination represents a fundamental violation. The crowds on the terraces, the gift shops in the outbuildings, the entrance fees and timed tickets and queue management, all of this is foreign to the romantic sensibility that gave the palace birth. But if we understand Ferdinand's vision more generously, as an attempt to demonstrate that beauty matters, that imagination has claims on reality, that the human spirit requires spaces of wonder, then perhaps the modern Pena Palace is not a betrayal, but a fulfillment. More people experience the palace now in a single year than visited it during the entire 19th century. The democratic access that tourism provides, for all its complications, represents a kind of completion of the romantic project. Beauty shared rather than hoarded, wonder available to the many rather than the few. The financial reality cuts across these interpretive possibilities. Whatever the palace means symbolically, it exists physically, and physical existence requires physical maintenance, and physical maintenance requires money. And money in the modern world comes from somewhere, from taxes or tickets, from governments or customers, from the collective will of societies that decide cultural heritage matters enough to pay for. Pena Palace survives today because enough people care enough to fund its survival. Some of that caring is expressed through entrance fees paid by individual visitors, choosing to spend their tourism euros at Sintra rather than elsewhere. Some is expressed through public investment by Portuguese government entities that have decided this piece of national heritage deserves support. Some is expressed through the labor of professionals who could earn more in other fields, but choose to dedicate their skills to conservation. The palace cannot survive on admiration alone. Love does not repair roof tiles. Wonder does not control humidity. Appreciation does not pay salaries. The gap between what beautiful places need and what we are willing to provide is the gap that has swallowed countless treasures across human history, monuments and artworks and landscapes that existed until they didn't, that were beautiful until they crumbled, that were admired by one generation and forgotten by the next. Pena has crossed this gap repeatedly, precariously, through decisions that sacrificed purity for survival. The decision to nationalize preserved the palace from private sale and potential destruction, but ended the royal vision that created it. The decision to restore under the Estado Novo preserved the physical fabric, but warped the historical interpretation. The decision to commercialize under Parques de Sintra preserved both fabric and access, but transformed the experience fundamentally. Each of these decisions was contested at the time and remains debatable now. None of them was clearly right or clearly wrong. All of them were necessary in the sense that the alternatives, inaction, different action, would have led to different outcomes and probably worse ones. The palace that exists today is the product of these accumulated decisions, the residue of choices made under pressure by people doing the best they could with the information and resources they had. This is how beautiful things survive, not through some magical immunity to time and change, but through continuous human effort, through institutions and systems that channel resources toward preservation, through the decisions of countless individuals to care enough to act. The survival is never guaranteed, never complete, never finally achieved. It is always ongoing, always precarious, always dependent on the next generation choosing to continue what the previous generation began. Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg could not have imagined the institution that now maintains his creation. He could not have imagined the crowds that now walk his terraces, the gift shop that now occupies his servants' quarters, the conservation laboratories where his paint samples are analyzed under electron microscopes. He could not have imagined and probably would not have approved. But his palace stands. His vision persists. His bet on the value of beauty is paid off in the only currency that matters in the end: continuation. The dream he dreamed alone on a foggy mountain has become a dream shared by millions, maintained by hundreds, financed by the collective will of a society that has decided this remnant of romantic aspiration is worth preserving. Stand now on the Queen's Terrace, the highest accessible point on the palace complex. The sun is setting over the Atlantic, painting the clouds in colors that Ferdinand would have appreciated and tried to capture in his watercolors. The crowds have thinned. The last tour groups are making their way to the exits. The palace is preparing for its nightly transition from public attraction to secured monument. In the failing light, you can almost see the ghosts. Ferdinand pacing the ramparts with his sketchbook, Maria watching from the chapel window, the Countess of Edla tending her chalet garden, the servants carrying water and firewood, the masons shaping stone, the painters mixing colors, the gardeners planting seeds that would grow into giants. all of them are gone now. All of them gave something to make this place exist and persist. Some gave their creative vision, others gave their labor power, still others gave their money or their expertise or their bureaucratic skill. The palace does not distinguish between contributions. It simply persists, the aggregate of all their efforts, the monument to its own survival. And tomorrow it will need more. More effort, more money, more decisions, more care. The roof will continue to leak until someone repairs it. The gardens will continue to grow until someone manages them. The visitors will continue to arrive until someone receives them. The institution will continue to function until someone funds and directs it. This is the truth that the romantic aesthetic tries to hide. There is no stable state for beautiful things. There is only ongoing care or progressive decay, active preservation or passive destruction. The choice is made not once but daily, in 1,000 small decisions that accumulate into continuity or collapse. The workers who rose before dawn in 1853 understood this, even if they could not have articulated it. They knew that the palace would not build itself, that their labor was required, that the dream in Ferdinand's mind would remain merely a dream without their hands to manifest it. They gave their contribution and moved on, replaced by others who gave theirs, and so on across generations. We are the current generation. The palace we inherit is the gift of those who came before. The palace we leave will be the gift to those who come after. Whether that gift is a thriving monument or a romantic ruin depends on choices we are making now and will continue to make. So who truly paid for this dream? Ferdinand paid, with his fortune and his obsession, and the family he might have enjoyed more fully had he not spent so many hours on the mountain. The workers paid with their labor and their bodies and the years of their lives exchanged for wages. The Portuguese state paid with the taxes that funded preservation during the Republican era. The visitors pay with their entrance fees that fund conservation today. The employees pay with the skill and dedication they bring to their work. Everyone pays in the end. Beauty is not free. It never was, though we like to imagine otherwise. The cost is always there, hidden or visible, acknowledged or denied. The fairy tale palace on the mountain exists because someone is always paying, has always been paying, will always need to be paying. And what does it cost to keep this dream alive today? Millions of euros annually, thousands of labor hours, the coordinated effort of a professional institution that did not exist in Ferdinand's era and might not exist in the future. The cost is high and rising, challenged by climate change, visitor pressure, and the relentless deterioration of physical materials. But perhaps cost is the wrong frame entirely. Perhaps we should ask instead what it would cost to let the dream die, to allow the roof to fail, the gardens to revert, the painted surfaces to weather into blank walls. What would we lose? We would lose one more reminder that human beings are capable of creating beauty for its own sake. We would lose one more space where imagination has been given physical form. We would lose one more connection to people who lived before us and cared about things that transcend individual lifetimes. These losses would be borne collectively but felt individually, in the lives of people who will never know what they missed, in the impoverishment of imagination that comes from living in a world stripped of wonder. The cost of preservation is real and countable. The cost of loss is real but uncountable, distributed across futures we cannot fully see. Pena Palace persists on the balance point between these costs, sustained by the collective decision that its persistence matters, that the dream is worth the price, that beauty has claims on reality that must be honored through effort and sacrifice. The fog is rising again from the Atlantic. The lights of Lisbon are flickering on in the distance. The palace is closing its doors for the night, preparing for the hours of darkness when no visitors walk its terraces and only the maintenance systems continue their work, regulating temperature and humidity, monitoring for intrusion and fire, keeping the dream stable until morning. Tomorrow, the gates will open again. The visitors will arrive with their cameras and their wonder. The staff will greet them, guide them, protect the fragile surfaces from curious hands. The gardeners will water the exotic plantings. The conservators will inspect their current projects. The managers will review budgets and projections. And the palace will continue one more day, one more year, one more generation, not because it must, not because it can sustain itself, not because any magic protects it from time, but because enough people choose to pay the price, to do the work, to keep the dream alive. This is how great beauty survives, not through admiration alone, but through service, not through wonder alone, but through labor, not through love alone, but through sacrifice. Ferdinand understood this, even if he preferred not to acknowledge it. The palace he built was always dependent on others, on the workers who shaped the stone, on the servants who maintained the households, on the gardeners who tended the exotic plants. His vision was the spark, but their labor was the fuel. The dream was his, but the sacrifice was theirs. Now the sacrifice is ours. The dream that passes to us is our responsibility to preserve or neglect, to maintain or abandon. We stand in the long line of those who have paid for Pena Palace, and we will hand it to those who come after, diminished or enhanced by the choices we have made. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through constant effort, through painful compromise, through the service of many, to preserve what one imagined. This is the lesson written in every crack that has been repaired, every roof that has been restored, every garden that has been rescued from wilderness. The palace in the clouds was never a gift from the heavens. It was and remains a human achievement, maintained by human hands, funded by human decisions, dependent on human care. Its survival is a choice we make and remake, daily and annually and generationally, for as long as we decide the dream is worth the price. The fog thickens around the towers. The last light fades from the Atlantic sky. The palace settles into darkness, a silhouette against the stars, waiting for morning and the endless work of another day.